The Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce runs a public lecture programme exploring contemporary issues. Teachers TV has access to these lectures, and today we bring you the lecture by psychologist Oliver James entitled Affluenza. Oliver James is a well-known psychologist, writer and broadcaster and author of the book The Affluenza Virus. Here he explores ideas of the relationship between materialism and mental health, and asserts that affluence is a fundamental contributor to mental illness. We've sent a group of teachers to listen to his talk, and we'll hear their responses after the lecture.
I want to really start, before really getting on to affluenza, I just want to set the full context of my argument. And in a sense, my talk this evening is going to be on the fundamental causes of mental illness. And as some of you may already know, my starting point on that subject goes back to Philip Larkin. And you can't be reminded often enough of Philip Larkin's wise words. They fuck you up, your mum and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can and don't have any kids yourself. That starting point has always seemed to me very important because it explains individual difference. But it doesn't actually, if you think carefully about the words of Larkin's poem, it's actually ambiguous as to whether he's saying it's nature or nurture that fucks you up. I mean, it could be that he's talking, and I don't know enough about Larkin's history to know whether what he actually did think about this, but it's certainly ambiguous as to whether the genes are passed down to you, they fuck you up because they pass their genes down to you, or whether what I suppose it's widely assumed he meant, which is that they fuck you up by their terrible maltreatment of you. But my starting point for any discussion of the fundamental causes of mental illness has to be genes. And I want to just very briefly update those of you who aren't aware of the latest evidence regarding the genetic causes of mental illness. If you take the main source of evidence there is on the impact of genes on why two siblings from the same family are different from each other, namely studies of identical twins. Contrary to what is often claimed, they don't actually show that it's a bit of both. It's a bit of both is a line that probably, I would guess, most of this audience who are pretty highly educated and knowledgeable and probably have given a bit of thought to it, you would probably, most of you say, well, it's a bit of both. And you'd look at your children and you'd explain to me why you think so. To which I would retort, well, actually, first of all, the evidence doesn't show that. The evidence shows that in the vast majority of traits, whether you're talking about personality, cognition, or psychopathology, actually, it's not a bit of both. In most cases, it's either nil. For example, there are plenty of studies, very surprisingly, there are plenty of studies actually of homosexuality, particularly a huge study in Australia of gay men, 2,000 gay men, identical twins. Absolutely nil genetic influence found in that study. There are plenty of studies that find no influence of genes at all, and many, many, many others, which are frequently cited, where it's not mentioned that they come up with maybe 20 or 30% heritability. So it's only when you get to the extreme mental illnesses and the exceptional case of IQ that you get to the bit of both, where you actually do get a 50% heritability for schizophrenia with twin studies, and even higher, 60% for bipolar disorder. And my point is that then that even if you accept the twin studies, a bit of both doesn't completely stand up. And remember, we're talking here about individual differences. We're talking about within a population why individuals differ. Anyway, twin studies are unreliable. If you don't believe me, you should read Joe Joseph's book, The Gene Illusion, which gives it to you chapter and verse. The evidence that is, I'm sure, the only evidence that we really can rely on is going to be molecular genetic studies, where they resulting from the Human Genome Project, where it is possible, really, to get to the bottom of this. Now, very interestingly, in recent times, in the last year, Robert Plomin, who's the main man when it comes to behavioral genetics, and others like Kenneth Kedler, have admitted, completely in great detail, that there are no genes for individual traits like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or things like that, which seem in themselves to be very rare and very peculiar, and so you think there would be individual genes, but they accept now that there are no genes for those on the basis of human genome studies. Although that doesn't stop yesterday's Guardian, I think it was, publishing a piece saying schizophrenia gene discovered, Edinburgh High Risk Project. Wait until the replication comes. That's what you need to do. I've been sitting reading, as I'm sure many of you have, reading these endless bloody articles about gene for this, gene for that, gene for homosexuality we've had often enough, never gets replicated. The only thing that is interesting in molecular genetics now has been a study that was a very clever study done in Dunedin in New Zealand, Avalon Caspi's study, which is very interesting, which showed, as a prospective longitudinal study of 1,000 New Zealanders, and found that if you had a particular genetic variant of what's called the serotonin transponder, if you had it, what's called the short allele, then if you were maltreated, you were vastly more likely to be violent, depressed, and to smoke a lot of dope. Now, if you had the long allele, you could be horrendously maltreated and not suffer any of these problems. This is what this study claimed. So I said, yeah, well, let's have the replication. Well, there have been 7 attempts to replicate it, which have partially replicated it. So what I'm saying is, molecular genetics, the case is still very, the jury is very much out on this. They admit themselves, Caspi et al., that it's very far from clear whether his work on the serotonin transponder really does stack up. So what I'm telling you now is that as things stand, as I understand it, if you look at the evidence on molecular genetics, it's absolutely unclear whether genes, it's quite possible that genes play absolutely no part in causing mental illness whatsoever. That is still absolutely possible. I don't think it's likely to be the case. I think genes probably do play a part. But at the moment, we have no idea. The other things to consider as regards genes as a cause is time trends. Think about it. In 1950, there were 6,000 crimes of violence against the person recorded. Before Jack Straw came along and screwed everything up by changing the way violence is recorded, in 98, as the last year that there were comparable figures, the number of crimes of violence against the police, against violence against the person recorded by the police, recorded was 252,000. Now, of course, that could be partly due to increased reporting, blah, 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 but hardly anybody would seriously sustain that view. Hardly anybody claims that, even the most demented flat earther, would admit that there has been a very substantial increase in the amount of violence in our society, as there clearly has been in the amount of alcoholism and all the aholias. There's a whole load of problems that never used to exist at all, like shopaholia or whatever. So time trends, another very interesting example, which I'll be coming back to a bit later, which I think is a particularly important study that everybody should be aware of, and which I actually wrote about in The Observer, was one about 15-year-old children. This was a study in which they measured rates of anxiety and depression and all the rest of it in 5,000 15-year-olds. That's a huge sample in the mid-80s. And then they measured similar outcomes in 5,000 more 15-year-olds in the mid-90s. And the fascinating thing was that, A, there was no increase in depression or anxiety amongst boys, nor were boys in any way more worried about school than they had been. Boys still couldn't give a shit about exams, basically, I'm very glad to say. However, there was a massive crisis in upper middle class girls, social class 1 and 2 girls, 24% of whom in the mid-80s were already depressed or anxious, and this has risen to 38%, over 1/3 of your daughters, because you are the upper middle classes, were suffering from depression and anxiety. And the reasons? Well, they were obsessed with school performance and exam performance, and not how pretty they were, but their bodies. And they were also not very happy with their home lives. Now that is an example of something that could not possibly have anything to do with genes whatsoever. A massive change in rates of mental illness, and also nicely against common sense in a way, because we're all of us well-educated folk know that the poor are much more likely to be mentally ill than the rich. So we're told, well, here's an example of one cohort, of one category of citizens where that's not true, because the 15-year-old girls from social class 4 and 5 were doing fine. In fact, I very much come to the conclusion this is the best time in the history of the world to be a social class 4 or 5 15-year-old girl. They're having a whale of a time compared to their ancestors. But their richer sisters are not. But my point is, it can't be due to genes. Finally, the thing that is the absolute clincher for me about the insignificance of genes, which I've only recently been aware of because of the work I've been doing for the book I've been writing, is cross-national trends, cross-national prevalences of mental illness. Now, obviously that's a hugely problematic area if you don't use exactly the same methods. And to address that, the World Health Organization have done, they really, psychiatrists are not much use for anything apart from as quite useful as pharmacists if you're having a psychotic episode. But they're essentially an extension of the pharmaceutical industry. But the other thing that they are good for, and they really are good at this, is measuring mental illness. And I mean, my dad was a psychoanalyst who actually trained as a doctor and psychiatrist at Maudsley way back in the 40s. And he always used to regale me with how hysterically funny it was, because there was absolutely no treatments then. But they spent their whole time measuring things. They measured. The great thing was diagnosis. And then they would diagnose the person and say, you suffer from a subclinical atomized, ongoing personality disorder with atypical features. And the person would say, great, okay, now, what's the answer? You didn't know. No, we don't know how to do anything about it, but we've decided what you are. Well, they are good at that. And the WHO study has so far reported for 15 nations. Now, there's massive differences, six-fold differences in rates of mental illness around the world. And this study can be trusted. They've gone to great lengths to make sure that, taking into account the way that different countries interpret words. The thing I will say for these psychiatrists is they do know how to sit somebody down for an hour and a half and come to a conclusion about whether they're bonkers or not. So, you've got to say something like a six-fold difference between, by far, the most bonkers society on earth, America, where in the USA, 26.4% of Americans have suffered from a mental illness in the last 12 months. 4.7% of people in Shanghai have. Similar, I think it's the same proportion in Nigeria. Massive difference. Couldn't be anything to do with genes. And we know it couldn't be to do with genes because if you compare rates of mental illness in mainland Western Europe with America, again, remember that most Americans originate from Europe. You get much lower rates in mainland Europe. So they've got the same genetic pool, but with very different mental illness. That is by way of quite a lengthy preface to try and persuade you that if we're interested in the fundamental causes of mental illness, we need to think very hard. Every time anybody mentions genes, my advice to you is to look long and hard at what's being said here, and is it really a replicated study? Is it really true? And that includes, of course, if you yourself are suffering from problems and a psychiatrist starts telling you it's in your family and therefore it must be genetic. Not logical. If it's in your family, it could just as well be because your parents have fucked you up. Suffice it to say that if you look at the evidence, and it is a huge body of evidence, the earlier you were maltreated, the more severely you were maltreated, the more likely you are to suffer from mental illnesses in later life. That includes now very sophisticated evidence about the ways in which your electrochemistry is influenced by the care you receive when you're small, so that your cortisol levels, even the size of bits of your brain, such as the hippocampal region of your brain or the amygdala, those things, if you're a woman and you were sexually abused as a child, on average, you have 5% less of your hippocampal region of your brain. The younger you were abused, the more closely related the person who abused you, i.e. if it's a family member, the more of your hippocampus is missing. And indeed, I suspect there is increasing, slowly the evidence is coming along that therapy can in fact reverse those things. It's the thermostat that's set by these experiences, but the thermostats can be changed. It's not easy. It's bloody difficult, frankly. It's incredibly difficult. But it is possible. What I am going to talk about primarily is affluenza, but I reminded you of the unimportance of genes, and I've also reminded you of the importance of early childhood care. And in explaining to you affluenza, I'm going to roam wide and far in my scientific as well as geographical locations. Affluenza I define as placing, I define it, in fact, Tim Cass's book, The High Price of Materialism, which is a fantastically good book, nice and short, a very clear summary of the solid scientific evidence that I'm about to regale you with. He calls it materialism, I call it affluenza for the sake of catching people's attention. Affluenza, I'm calling it placing a high value on money, possessions, appearances, and that by which I mean physical, obviously, but also social appearances, like social status, sort of thing. Alain talks about, Alain de Botton was talking about, or what I talked about in Britain on the Couch. And fame. Placing a high value on those four things: money, possessions, appearances, and fame. That's what I'm saying is affluenza. And what Tim Cass and colleagues have found in samples in 14 different countries is that if you measure people's level of materialism or affluenza and you correlate it with their mental health, you find the people who are afflicted by materialism are more likely, statistically significantly, to suffer from depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and narcissistic personality disorder. If you know what I mean by that, me. Now, why then would it be, now, I mean, before I get on to why, just think about what I said. That's an amazing body of evidence, that. It's fascinating that I haven't heard of it in the newspapers anywhere. You read about the bloody schizophrenia study in The Guardian yesterday, but have you read the latest, every time a new study comes out showing that materialism does your head in? Funnily enough, absolutely nothing about it in the papers at all. These studies that I'm telling you about, it's very unlikely any of you will have heard of them before. Anyway, why does it make you bonkers, to make it disturb you, to be materialistic? Well, Tim Kasser and co. present a whole lot of evidence to suggest that it's firstly because we have a fundamental need to feel secure, and if you're a materialist, it makes you much more likely to feel insecure. You're always feeling that you haven't got enough of whatever material goal or motive that you're after. So I'm not attractive enough, I'm not rich enough, whatever. Insecurity. Secondly, if you're a materialist, you're much more likely to not be plugged into communities, not to have intimates, to feel lonely, to put it very simply. Materialists, we read about them every day of the week if you read the tabloids. The loneliness that so many very successful people, David Blunkett, most recently, and of course, fascinatingly, many of the people at the top of New Labour, who have placed ambition material ambitions far ahead of everything else. And it leaves you feeling very disconnected from other people. Thirdly, it leaves you feeling ineffective. We have a fundamental need to feel effective. And if you're plugged into this, what's often called the hedonic treadmill, it's very difficult to feel effective because you never achieve enough. You're never going to get, your best is never good enough. You're never satisfied. And however hard you try, it's always your fault in this schema, in this frame of mind. So you just got to try even harder, work even harder. But yet, you always feel as if you're never quite there. You always feel you're failing. And then finally, we have an absolutely fundamental need for authenticity and autonomy. And those needs are very badly impaired by the pursuit of material goals. I would also add to that playfulness, which Tim Kasser doesn't talk about, but I'm very much an apostle, if you like, of Donald Winnicott and his work, and his not easy to read, I admit, but his book Playing in Reality, if you can get your head around it, gives a very important account, I think, of a whole dimension of experience which is very sadly lacking in modern life. To put it another way, the way that Erich Fromm famously did, if you're a materialist, and he put it way back in the 50s, he wrote two hugely important books, but the most important was The Same Society, 1955. And in that book, he prefigured R.D. Laing by 20 years in saying that we live in a crazy society and you'd have to be mad to be well adjusted to it. How true that is. Being well adjusted to this society is very, very difficult to do that and not be feeling pretty screwed up. And Fromm also, of course, famously wrote a book called To Have or To Be. And in many ways, I think that the best way to summarize the impact of materialism is that it encourages you to put having before being, the pursuit of wants confected by advertisers to a very large degree and by the wider society, the media, putting wants before needs. Our needs are really very few and simple, the four ones that I listed: security, community, intimacy, to feel effective, and authenticity, autonomy. To have those needs met, you do not need a lot of money. And the studies show quite clearly that you really don't need more than around about 20 grand a year, really, to meet your needs in the society. But how many people here would be happy to try and meet their needs on 20 grand a year? You wouldn't be. But that's because you're confusing your needs with your wants. Please don't get the impression that I'm talking from a position of somebody who's managed to totally cure myself of this problem, because of course I suffer from it too. If you really get down to it, if you really get into this, the vast majority of the people I'm talking to here today will be living in perfectly good houses, probably, in fact, houses that are way beyond your real means. And in fact, you could trade in your existing house, probably this audience, and buy somewhere much cheaper in a less fashionable place, and take an enormous amount of pressure off you. The property market is an absolutely crucial driver of the incredibly screwed up materialist society that we live in. Another simple example is the exam obsession that now dominates us. I mentioned that study of 15-year-olds because I think it's so poignant. It so happens that the mid-80s and the mid-90s, that was the period in which women, girls, overtook boys in the GCSEs. They started off in the mid-80s as having about the same GCSE results. I think it was equal. As every fool know, girls are now outperforming boys massively. But at what price? The best way I can characterize for you the trap that materialism presents in terms of psychopathology is to describe a few examples of people I met around the world. In Sydney, I met somebody called Will, who rather unusually is a multi-millionaire. He actually lost it all once and has made it all again. Who's also a psychiatrist. And I spent a couple of days with him, very, very interesting. He works 18 hours a day. According to him, none of his relationships aren't part of his working life. He didn't mention his wife or children once in all the time that we spoke. The great issue for him, perhaps because he's a psychiatrist, is what is his diagnosis? And I think this is why he bothered to talk to me for such a long time. He was using me as a kind of sounding board. Is he subclinical bipolar disorder? Or is he suffering from adult ADHD? This is the question. What he didn't realize, I think, is that he, in fact, is an absolutely classic case of what Erich Fromm called the marketing character. And it just so happens that, as of course, the marketing character is not to be found in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychiatric Disorders, but it's a very distinct pathology. And funnily enough, it was an Australian who only back in 2000 started empirically investigating what it consists in. And Sean Saunders showed that people who are marketing characters are eager to consume, wasteful of their consumer goods, and they dispose of them and replace them frequently. They have very conventional tastes and views. They're uncritical of themselves or society. They're uninsightful. They agree with statements like having makes me more. They have a tendency to publicize and promote themselves. They experience themselves as a commodity whose value is defined and determined by the opinions of others and their possessions. And they see others as commodities to be manipulated. And indeed, when you actually read up on this, it's very, very interesting, because there's a whole lot of literatures that those of you who work in personnel would find most interesting. There's one literature on what's called the Machiavellian personality, which is an absolute gripper. It's all about, there's a Mach scale, so you can measure how much people are Macs or not, and then correlate it with all sorts of things. And a Mach, as the name suggests, is someone who's extremely manipulative and sees other people as pawns to be moved around on the chessboard. Links up very much with another literature called the ludic lover, somebody who sees sex as a game and getting the other person to have sex with you as winning, and then that person's no longer any interest to you. There's another literature on hyper-competitiveness, people who are fanatically obsessed with winning. And of course, you will have heard of the concept of personality disorder, which comes in many different forms. But most recently, Belinda Board did a cracking good study which showed that in the case of 4 personality disorders, particularly narcissistic personality disorder, senior managers, a decent-sized sample of senior managers, were more personality disordered than prisoners in Broadmoor or psychiatric patients. Think about that. And it is a fundamental conclusion I've come to in the last few years, has been that one of the great challenges that faces us if we're really to progress as a civilization beyond all past civilizations would be, how the hell do you get a society which is ruled by people who understand that the way we're cared for in early life is crucial, and who are not complete shits? Because hardly any of the people who run our societies or who become very successful, especially in the English-speaking world, are anything other than personality disorder, Machiavel, marketing, blah, blah, blah. It's a real problem, and I don't know what the answer is. I'd be fascinated if anybody's got any clues how you do it. My best idea so far was the idea that nobody could become an MP without having spent 2 weeks full time looking after an under 3-year-old. And I think you'd find that none of our present rulers have done that. To give you, on my travels, many of the most interesting people I interviewed, in fact, the most sort of exotic specimens of flora and fauna of materialism, were the millionaires. In each country I interviewed a few millionaires. But equally, wherever I went, I also came across people like us, people who, I'm assuming there aren't many multi-millionaires in the audience, but people who are living in a time of unprecedented affluence, who are more or less plagued by, to greater or lesser degrees, anxiety, depression, substance abuse, personality disorder. And one of the things that I found particularly striking was how screwed up, and this is something I wrote about at some length in Britain on the Couch, but I was surprised to find it was so true all around the world, the extent to which the relationships between the sexes are screwed up, particularly in the English-speaking world. A story you hear all the time in Britain, and people thinking that if they move to a different town or to a different relationship, that everything's going to be much better, because they're locked into a commodified notion of themselves and the people that they're with, and because they really do believe that relationships, that they should be having something much better than what they've got. The incapacity that we have to appreciate what we've got, be it our houses, our exam results, it doesn't matter what. We are so dissatisfied with what we've got. And the evidence, there's a particularly interesting study, actually, I would mention in passing, on this, a study of 8,000 British mothers by Tom O'Connor. 8,000 British mothers who had a small child and a partner. And it found that when they were interviewed a year later, the mothers who'd split up were more likely to be depressed than those who were still with their partners. Now you could say, well, maybe that's not so surprising. But you might have thought that if a relationship was really shitty, then once the mothers were out of it, they would be less depressed. But on the contrary, it showed that however disharmonious the relationship had been, up to and including some very, very nasty relationships, in most cases, statistically significantly, the mother felt no better on escaping. And indeed, being depressed could be the cause of breakups. Because if the mother was depressed during the relationship, separation was more likely. So this is a very modern problem, that we've gotten to this idea that we should have a perfect relationship, we should have a perfect everything, and we commodify our relationships. We see them as a car that can be exchanged. So what's my conclusion? Well, it won't surprise you to hear that my conclusion is that Tony Blair has definitely not been a good thing for us in this respect. In terms of materialism, New Labour has been an absolute disaster. I recently wrote something in The Guardian about this, how appallingly materialistic the core New Labour people are. Maybe not Brown, maybe not Straw, but I've had a bit to do with quite a lot of them, and I'm sorry to say they are basically yuppies. And Blackshire and Nouveau Labour, have definitely not been very helpful. I think that I'm sure many of you realise that a lot of what I'm saying knits very much into the recent report on climate and the need for us to do something about that. It's a very interesting question, which some of you might want to discuss. What exactly is the relationship between materialism, this all-pervasive materialism, that is far greater than it has been in the past, and our problems with the climate? How do we bring about change? You can see that what my argument is going to be, we need, if we're going to have climate change, if we're going to change our ecological policies, we need a fundamental change in our values, absolutely fundamental. And I'll leave you with this thought, something I haven't mentioned so far. If you read Avner Offer's really very good book, The Challenge of Affluence, Avner is actually an economist, but he argues that a fundamental problem that's come about is that the economics of the domestic income, domestic household economy, in which we have dual income household economies. We have to. If we're going to keep up with the Joneses, we have to earn a hell of a lot more money than most individuals can earn. So I've got to leave the children in the nursery because we can't afford not to. That, I believe, is the starting point for change. The starting point for change is to start having a governance which is premised on meeting the needs of small children. And in order to do that, we have to increase the status of people who look after them. And in order to do that, we have to persuade men, as well as women, to think that it really would be something that they could feel good about themselves if they were doing the care. Where on earth does this idea come from that it's actually better to pay somebody else to look after your children, for God's sake? And in fact, most people would prefer not to have to. This is not arguing that women should be chained back to the kitchen sink. An awful lot of women are not particularly suited to caring for their small children full time. an awful lot of men are. But my principal policy argument that we should pay the average annual salary at whatever it is at any one time to one or other parent, and it could be as much the man as the woman, to care for their under 3-year-old, because it would change the status of that activity. And because, sadly, we're so fucked in the head that it's only possible for us to feel good. And I'm not blaming anyone here. I'm saying I suffer from it as much as anyone else. But in my own family, in the families around me, those people who decide not to have paid work and to look after their children, whether it's part-time or full-time, have no status. They have the status less than a street sweeper. They're despised. And I think that is the most damaging feature of our modern life. And I think that if we can accept, okay, so let's accept that the only thing that matters in this stupid society is money. Okay, well, let's start from where people are at. Let's pay them to look after their own children. And then let's see. And let's see if people start to think again about what really matters. Anyway, that's my particular individual bugbear. I'm sure that many of you will say, well, you're miles off. There are many other much more important things. And I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
John Stevenson, fellow retired. I'm wondering whether your book will address my particular issue, which is relevant to what you said about needs and wants. When I was a younger man bringing up our family, we had a small amount of income and were therefore very much looking at needs and not much at wants.
Well, obviously, you have to distinguish, as I do, between relative materialism and absolute materialism. And you, in your relatively modest home, if you start getting into, yes, but what about really poor people in really poor societies, then of course that they are meeting needs. They're not meeting wants. They're meeting you need food, you need a roof over your head, etc. But of course, I'm talking about people like us who are miles away from those problems.
Hi, my name's Amanda Stone, and I worked in Singapore and Shanghai, and I certainly saw a lot of characteristics that I think you've described, but I didn't see much depression. So I'm just interested if you could share some of your findings.
Well, I leap in there with such excitement because that was one of the things that was so interesting, because 3/4 of the Singapore population are of Chinese descent. They have the same genes as the Chinese population, and yet very, very different. Marketing characters all over the place. 5 times more depression and anxiety in Singapore than there is in Shanghai. Now, having said that, Shanghai is an absolute gripper if you're interested in affluenza, because Shanghai, as every Guardian reader knows, is completely in the grip of affluenza at the moment. And they're all demented with their love of luxury fever and all the rest of it. But yet, they have the lowest rate of mental illness anywhere in the world within the WHO 15-nation study. Now, how on earth can that be? That's a serious contradiction of my thesis. Well, needless to say, I do have an answer. And the thing that I think, the theory that I have is that what's protecting them to some extent in the short term is Confucianism. Because Confucian, he say many wise things. And to what extent, I personally think Confucianism will not protect them when they get in the full grip of Americanized bullshit. But at the moment, they still have a lot of very sensible thoughts going through their heads alongside the American bullshit.
Christopher Goodhart Fellow, I'm just interested that you refer to the whole concept under nurture of maltreatment and abuse. Don't you think there's actually a case that in fact there's been too much good treatment and laziness towards children, so it's much easier to give in to what children want? You you don't treat them in a way that gives them any kind of nurture. So we've actually we've fucked them up in a different kind of way.
Yes, I think it's true. There's a huge body of evidence that if you want your child to be mentally healthy or reasonably able to function in a normal society, or even an abnormal one like ours, the rewards and punishments need to be consistent, and there do need to be some. And I think that's true. But the 60s and 70s, that went by the board, and it is being reinstated. But unfortunately, what's going on is that now I think what's happening is that, as Avner Offer shows so convincingly, parents are so invested in their marketing characters that they really find it hard to remember just to have some fun with their children. Their children are incredibly good fun. They have such good fun. Speaking as a father of small children, you'll suddenly realise that everything you've lived up to now is a nonsense compared to it.
I'm a governor at a secondary school, and to what extent do you think our education system, which is a combination of a system aimed at achievement and attaining, but also has some of the most caring individuals involved in it, to what extent does it reinforce the damage that's done or mitigate against the damage that's done by parents?
I think that the teaching profession as a whole in the state sector, particularly in the primary part of the state sector, are kind of absolute saints, and they obviously do their very best in most cases to try and direct their pupils away from the kind of nonsense that New Labour wants them to imbibe. But unfortunately, they're up against, as you would know as a school governor, they really are up against a very, very difficult problem, which is that they've now had several decades of governments who are only interested in creating good little consumer producers and are not interested in setting minds free, in doing what education should be doing, which is to actually create a love of scholarship and a fascination with the world and all the rest of it, all the cliches that we all know about. There is still a hell of a lot of teachers who are just, doing their level best in virtually impossible circumstances to try and, set people free rather than imprison them. I think
I just want to pose thanks to Oliver for thought-provoking and enjoyably controversial discussion.
Oliver James has argued that our society values having more than being, and that this is a fundamental contributor to mental illness. How do these thoughts resonate with our teachers and their experiences in schools?
What I found really interesting is a lot of my work is trying to get children to kind of question and think about their own value systems and think about the clothes they wear and the choices that they make in their life. And they are, in a sense, victims of the consumer culture, because they can't really help it. It's TV, it's everything just coming at them. And the only chance that they've got to sort of think outside that is if other people support them in saying, well, that's one way of thinking about it. There's other stuff going on as well. It's not just that one system, which very much our society is. And I suppose Oliver James's lecture made me think, it kind of just affirmed that is a really important thing to do if we are going to kind of challenge a very affluent society. To get young people, they're the future.
I thought it was interesting how he mentioned the higher rate of depression and anxiety in girls. And I think you can really clearly see that in our society with magazines aiming the way they are and their image and the me and the fame. And I think that does have a bigger impact on girls.
The whole problem with the girls also highlighted the fact that he said girls are driven by various things, and it stems from the parenting, which was his big focal point, that under 3 should be carefully looked after and nurtured. But I don't know whether we're sort of going backwards then. I just thought that was all a bit bizarre. I perhaps fall in that percent where I didn't want to be at home bringing up children. I would get no intrinsic value from that. I'd be torn apart. And then I wouldn't be giving my children the right values anyway, because I'd be depressed about my status. So I didn't quite agree with this whole look after them under 3, for sure, but then who gets to look after them? You know, we're saying there are problems with these 15-year-olds. Why aren't parents then saying, you know, are my kids actually going to school every day and enjoying that experience?
I think as the children get older, the parents start to want performance more, don't they?
Well, exactly.
And they start to wish on their children what they perhaps wanted for themselves.
Exactly.
I think it's perhaps that's the case in many cases, but it is not. It's not the case across the board.
No.
What I see as a real bright ray of hope on the horizon with that is the National Healthy School Standard, which does involve parents as well as the children and the staff, the whole school community, and it's about emotional health and well-being as well as physical health and well-being. Those things are sometimes forgotten, and it's reflected for me in the fact that PSHE has never been a statutory subject.
Can I be a bit provocative? Because I think that there are times when I feel that the PSHE curriculum is an add-on that needn't necessarily be there.
Yes.
If the family was working right, if the home was working right, if the curriculum was properly designed, we wouldn't need to have an artificial set of curricula. Well, the curriculum is such that it doesn't make room for a child's curiosity. It doesn't make room for a child's self-esteem. It doesn't make room for awe and wonder and all the things that undergird the development of the real inner child.
In order to kind of make space for different attitudes and values to be celebrated, you've got to model that in the classroom. You've got to have space for discussion when people can say, I disagree, or I think differently, and that isn't going to be that's wrong or whatever, that there isn't a difference between, you know, that's a better attitude and that isn't. And that's something that's hard to nurture, but even if it's in the school ethos, it has to be happening in the classroom as well. PSHE education is good education. You've got to have that stuff in place. Otherwise, how are you going to get good at literacy? How are you going to get your best SATs results? You know?
But that's the thing.
Intrinsic and
saying,
extrinsic.
I think it was affirming of what good teachers have been doing all the time, whether they agree or not with the main text of the national curriculum and what we're required to do as teachers. There's a subtext beneath that, which good teachers have always been applying in their classrooms, valuing their children, respecting their children, listening to their children, giving them a voice and giving them an opportunity to talk about the things that really matter, regardless of what the actual main agenda says. And it was affirming. I thought that was important.
The point you said is brilliant, because it also ties up with what he said about your children. You should be having fun. Children are great. If you get out there and just have fun with them, it's amazing what you'll get out of them, whether it's your own children or the children you're teaching. And that, I think, if you're in education and you can have fun with your kids in the class, you'll get them to do amazing things.
I suppose I feel positive about it, because although it's a very we're fighting against this huge sea, at least we're doing something, and at least we are listening to children, and we're trying to get them to think about the world in different ways, and that's all that we can try to do.